Over the past few weeks, a quiet but consistent thread has emerged across several of golf's most credible outlets, with Golf Digest, Golf Channel, and Yahoo Sports independently reporting on behind-the-scenes discussions tied to the 2026 Masters. And while none claim a finalized decision or suggest an announcement is imminent, together their reporting points to something highly unusual: a deliberate internal review of how the tournament approaches 2026. When multiple respected publications begin circling the same topic without coordination, it's rarely coincidence, and the intrigue deepens with Augusta National's complete silence. No press release, no denial, no clarification, a familiar pattern that often signals something already in motion but not yet ready for daylight. At Augusta, there are no small changes, and even the suggestion of recalibration around field composition, qualification criteria, or eligibility pathways carries massive implications, shaping careers, legacies, and the competitive balance of golf's most iconic week. Strip away the speculation and a clear pattern forms, as all three outlets align on one central point. Augusta National is reassessing how the 2026 Masters field is constructed, not the venue or the date, but who receives an invitation. Golf Channel's reporting focuses on early field projections and a growing emphasis on ranking-based inclusions, framing the shift not as expansion or contraction but as refinement, subtle changes that could alter the profile of the field without changing its size. Golf Digest pushes the conversation further, examining what those adjustments could mean for the identity of the Masters itself, suggesting that even minor tweaks may quietly tilt the balance between tradition and modern competitive reality, influencing how long-past champions remain exempt, how international players are evaluated, and ultimately what the Masters represents as the game itself continues to evolve. Change the inputs and the feel of the week inevitably evolves, whether Augusta admits it or not, and that makes it crucial to separate what's confirmed from what's speculative. What's confirmed is that internal discussions, early modeling, and scenario planning for 2026 are taking place. What remains speculative is how far those changes go and who they ultimately affect most. One truth, however, never changes: Augusta National does not leak by accident, which raises the obvious question of why these stories are surfacing now. From the outside, any adjustment tied to the Masters can feel jarring, but internally the logic is far more measured. Augusta no longer operates in a golf world that exists in isolation, as global tours, shifting alliances, and fragmented competitive pathways have made direct comparison harder than ever. And for an invitational defined by field selection, those pressures can't simply be ignored in the name of tradition. Ranking volatility sits at the center of that tension, with world rankings no longer offering a clean, universally trusted snapshot of form as different tours carry different strengths, limited schedules distort data, and elite players rise or fall without clear competitive context. Coverage from Yahoo Sports suggests this uncertainty has forced organizers across the sport to rethink how merit is measured, and for Augusta, whose credibility rests on field quality, ignoring that reality would be the greater risk. This moment isn't about radical reinvention but prevention, making quiet refinements now to avoid visible controversy later and protect competitive balance without being forced into public reaction. History supports that approach, as past changes to eligibility, exemptions, and international access were once criticized before becoming accepted parts of the Masters fabric, reinforcing the idea that the 2026 discussions signal continuity rather than disruption. The immediate impact of any adjustment will be felt most by players on the margins, those hovering near ranking thresholds or relying on late-season form, where even subtle shifts contain a career-defining invitation into a near-miss. International players sit squarely in the middle as well, as increasingly complex global pathways make cross-tour evaluation difficult, meaning small recalibrations could quietly reshape the geographic makeup of the field over time. Add to that the delicate balance between honoring legacy and rewarding current relevance, and even modest changes could accelerate generational turnover, tightening windows that once stayed open longer. What makes this moment especially consequential is that one altered pathway doesn't just affect a single Masters field, it can quietly redefine opportunity, expectation, and access for years to come. It changes momentum, preparation, and career planning. And for some players 2026 won't feel like a breakthrough at all, but rather the moment they sense a door quietly beginning to close. A reality that carries extra weight in a tournament where opportunity is intentionally scarce and timing is everything. If history is any guide, Augusta National won't rush to explain itself, because silence has always been one of the master's most powerful tools, allowing expectations to reset naturally without binding the club to language it may later regret. In many ways, that restraint is the message, a signal that decisions are still being shaped behind closed doors and that the world is meant to wait. The real clues won't come through headlines or press conferences but through subtler signs, invitation lists, qualification confirmations, and carefully chosen phrasing that quietly reveals which pathways now matter most. What's important to understand is what this moment is not. It's not a rejection of tradition and it's not a reaction to outside noise, but a calculated effort to preserve competitive integrity before instability elsewhere forces a public response. That's why 2026 already feels different without a single announcement, not because the Masters is changing its identity, but because it's choosing how to protect it on its own terms, raising the lingering question of whether this is the moment Augusta quietly stepped into a new era. Against that backdrop, the contrast couldn't be sharper than with John Daly, a figure who has spent decades operating outside golf's polished image, earning attention through raw honesty rather than diplomacy. When Daly recently delivered blunt criticism of the PGA Tour, there was no humor to soften it and no self-interest driving it, only deliberate frustration voiced plainly. And that's why it landed harder than most quotes ever do. Daly doesn't need attention, so when he speaks this directly, it feels less like commentary and more like a warning, one that forces the sport to listen whether it's comfortable or not, because when one of golf's most independent voices speaks this clearly, it signals that something deeper is shifting beneath the surface, and if John Daly is saying it out loud, others are likely thinking it quietly, which is where the real story begins. Strip away the headlines and reactions, and Daly's comments were far more calculated than they first appeared, focusing not on himself but on an issue rarely centered in pro golf: how caddies are treated. He questioned why the people carrying bags, managing yardages, and traveling nonstop receive so little structural support from the system they help sustain, framing it not as an emotional plea but as a practical critique of how resources are distributed. From there, Daly widened the lens to financial inequality, arguing not that elite players are overpaid, but that the ecosystem beneath them is underprotected, especially compared to rival tours offering stipends, guarantees, and clearer safety nets. Crucially, he positioned this as a systemic failure, not a personal grievance, referencing years of private conversations with players, caddies, and insiders who share the same frustrations but feel constrained from speaking. Daly didn't introduce a new problem. He verbalized an old one, and that's what gives his words weight. With nothing to gain and no relevance to chase, his honesty reads less like criticism and more like testimony. And for a PGA Tour already under pressure from LIV Golf, fractured loyalties, and a shifting narrative about what the future of the sport looks like, his timing couldn't be worse. In a moment where unity feels fragile and perception matters as much as performance, Daly's unfiltered clarity is hard to dismiss precisely because it isn't transactional, negotiated, or self-serving. John Daly's comments are powerful precisely because they are observational rather than self-serving. When criticism comes from someone with skin in the game, it can be debated or dismissed. When it comes from someone with nothing to lose, it lingers. And that is what makes Daly's words symbolic. As a major champion and a survivor of multiple eras, he commands respect even from those who disagree with him. By voicing publicly what many whisper privately, Daly didn't create a crisis. He illuminated one. And once that light is on, it's hard to turn off. The reaction to his remarks wasn't just shock, it was recognition. Daly represents something increasingly rare in modern professional golf: authenticity. In a sport that has become polished, sponsor-friendly, and carefully managed, he stands out because his career has always felt human, messy, and real. His blunt honesty cuts through corporate messaging, and fans instinctively recognize the difference between a statement designed to reassure and one meant to reflect reality. Against this backdrop, the contrast between the PGA Tour's carefully worded narratives and Daly's plain-spoken critique of fairness, respect, and overlooked contributors couldn't be clearer. That imbalance fuels the perception that the Tour prioritizes image over understanding its audience, eroding trust quietly but rapidly. Daly embodies an older generation of golf that values character over branding and honesty over optics, and as nostalgia meets frustration, it generates a cultural resonance institutions ignore at their peril. Importantly, Daly's comments aren't the problem, they are a symptom. The frustration he voiced didn't appear overnight. It reflects a broader unease with a system that looks progressive but feels misaligned. His remarks reveal unrest beneath the surface, not rebellion, not collapse, but discomfort, and highlight the widening credibility gap between the PGA Tour's messaging and the lived experience of players, caddies, and fans. Once that gap is visible, it is impossible to overlook. This puts pressure on the PGA to respond not with statements but with substance. Reform rarely arrives through confrontation. It often comes through moments of uncomfortable clarity. Daly didn't demand change. He highlighted imbalance. How the tour interprets that insight versus criticism could define its next chapter. Institutions seldom shift because they are attacked. They shift when silence no longer protects them. The real question now isn't about Daly. It's about what comes next. Will the PGA act and adapt before frustration calcifies into division? Or will more players, past, present, and future, feel compelled to speak with the same candor? Because when someone like Daly speaks so plainly, he isn't asking to be heard. He's signaling that others already are.